everyone. Welcome back to another trip to the dark side. I'm your host, Sherry, and I'm so thankful to have you here with me. Today, we're talking about Chris McCandless. At 24 years old, he ventured out into the Alaskan wilderness. He wanted to be as far from society as he could get. To help understand who Chris was and his mindset, I'll give you his own words he wrote in his journal. I think you should really make a radical change in your lifestyle and begin to boldly do things you previously may never have thought of doing or been too hesitant to attempt. So many people live within unhappy circumstances and yet will not take the initiative to change their situation because they're conditioned to a life of security, conformity, and conservatism, all of which may appear to bring peace of mind, but in reality, nothing is more damaging to the spirit within a man than a secure future. The very basic core of a man's living spirit is his passion for adventure. The joy of life comes from our encounters and experiences, and hence there is no greater joy than having an endlessly changing horizon. If you really want to get more out of life, you must lose your inclination for monotonous security. Chris McCandless will be found dead in an abandoned bus in the Alaskan wilderness 20 miles from any sort of civilization. When he was found, he weighed 67 pounds. We'll discuss today what led to that point. I've been thinking about Chris McCandless' story for a number of years, and I thought it was time I finally talked about it. Many look at Chris's story and wonder what it means to live authentically. What do we owe to our families who raised us? And how far would we go to chase freedom? For some, Chris is a hero, a young man who had the courage to leave behind a world obsessed with money and repetition of the same things every day. For others, he's an idiot and a wealthy, privileged kid who underestimated the wild and paid for his arrogance with his life. This is episode 172, The Case of Christopher McCandless. We're heading back to 1992 for this story. Bill Clinton was elected the U.S. president. We had the L.A. riots. Barney the dinosaur made his debut on TV. Hurricane Andrew hit Florida. The Silence of the Lambs won multiple Oscars. Mae Jemison was the first black woman to enter space. And in weird news from 1992, Pepsi released Crystal Pepsi. It was a cola, but it was crystal clear. I remember being 11 and begging my dad to buy it. It tasted just like Pepsi. The fad sizzled out a year later in 1993. Chris McCandless was born February 12, 1968 in Los Angeles to parents Walter and Billy. He had a sister named Corrine, who was 3 years younger. Chris's father, Walt, was an aerospace engineer who worked for NASA. Chris grew up very privileged. He always had everything he needed in life. But we learned later that Walter allegedly was a violent man who was good at portraying this picture-perfect marriage and family. We didn't learn this from Chris, though. We learned it from Chris's sister, who, long after Chris's death, wrote a tell-all book. Allegedly, Dad Walter was physically violent to his wife, but would occasionally take it out on the two kids, and eventually their mother became his accomplice in the abuse. They provided everything for their kids. They had nice vacations and they were able to attend good schools, but behind closed doors, it was a different story. Their parents, Walter and Billy, have denied these abuse allegations. Chris learned later in life that before his mom and dad married, his dad had been married to another woman and had 6 children with her. When Chris and Corrine were born, he was still legally married to his wife and apparently bouncing back and forth between the families, trying not to get caught. This news infuriated Chris because he felt like his whole life was a lie. Walter got another job with NASA working as an antenna specialist, so he is going to pack up his wife Billy, son Chris, and daughter Corrine, and they're going to move across the country. They moved to Virginia in 1976 when Chris was just 8 years old. Chris grew up as an athletic kid who was incredibly smart. He excelled in pretty much everything he did. He was the captain of the high school's cross-country team. One of his former teammates remembered him by saying, quote, "He would lead us on long killer runs as far and as fast as we could go, down strange roads, through the woods, whatever. The whole idea was to lose our bearings, to push ourselves into unknown territory. Then we'd run at a slower pace until we found a road we recognized and race home again at full speed." In a certain sense, that's how Chris lived his entire life. There's lots of stories about Chris in high school. He once picked up a homeless guy and brought him back to his house. The homeless man was shocked that Chris lived in this beautiful home since he met him walking in a rough area. He let the guy stay in his parents' vacation camper in the driveway, and his parents had no idea this man was staying there. His mom and dad would leave for work in the morning and walk right past the camper, not knowing that a stranger is living in there. He also rescued stray animals and would give whatever he was eating to anyone who looked like they needed it. So Chris is a straight-A student all through high school, graduating in 1986. Then he would attend Emory University in the fall. This college is in Atlanta, Georgia, so it's a good distance from his parents back in Virginia. The thing with Chris is that he was naturally just so smart. He didn't even have to try. But it was almost like he didn't want this. He had this attitude that all of this was meaningless, even refusing Phi Beta Kappa honors. This was a prestigious honor, and Chris is like, nah, I don't want it. His classmates say that Chris got by with very little. He didn't have a lot of stuff in his dorm. He was also pretty introverted. When the other college students were partying, Chris would be found reading Henry David Thoreau under a tree. As he nears graduation, his parents are trying to convince him to further his education and start the next fall at Harvard Law School. Chris 100% had the opportunity to get into Harvard, but he says no. He has no desire to do something like this, even with his parents telling him that they would pay for it themselves. Chris graduated from Emory University in the spring of 1990. He graduated with 2 bachelor's degrees, one in history, one in anthropology. His parents come out to Atlanta to watch him graduate and take him to dinner. Walter and Billy tell Chris that they have a surprise for him. They have a brand new car as his graduation gift. Chris drives this older yellow Datsun that is not in great shape. So a new car would be like a huge step up from his current ride. Instead of being excited, he scolds his parents and tells them that he doesn't want it. He later said he was disgusted by their act of buying him a new car. It makes me wonder if he was just so turned off by material possessions, or if his relationship with his parents was so bad that he doesn't want anything from them. I think it was a combination of the two. His parents are expecting that Chris was going to continue on to another more prestigious college, or he was going to go work earning top dollar with his 2 bachelor's degrees he now had. But Chris decides he doesn't want to do either of these. This moment was a turning point. He saw their ambitions, a nice house, business, success, money, as shallow. He hated the idea of becoming trapped in the same cycle. Chris cut ties with his family and he's going to take off. Now, Chris has a lot of money in the bank for being 22 years old. He has $24,000. I remember being 22, and if I had an extra $50 in my paycheck after bills, I was ecstatic. So this $24,000 he has would definitely fund his adventure. Except he's not going to use it. Instead, he donates it to a charity called Oxfam that feeds the needy. In June 1990, he got in his old yellow Datsun and began heading west. For the next 2 years, Chris is going to document his life in journals. He doesn't have a cell phone, he doesn't have a computer, but he has a journal and books. He's so anti-everything that he's riding on expired registration and no insurance. To him, having insurance is too close to being normal. For the second half of 1990 and all of 1991, Chris was on the West Coast. He has completely cut ties with his parents. They have no idea where he is. They hired a private investigator who learned about Chris's $24,000 donation to charity. His parents were really hurt by this. He arrives in Arizona and Chris gets caught in a flash flood. The water was coming up over the hood of his car and flooded the engine. Rather than seeing this as a disaster, Chris welcomed it. To him, the destruction of his vehicle was symbolic. It was helping him to break from the trap of modern life. He abandoned the car, leaving most of his possessions inside. He left a note stating that whoever could get the vehicle running was welcome to keep it. The police eventually found it, and they ended up getting it running and using it as the department's surveillance car. He took his .22 rifle and buried it in the desert, and he would come back for it later. He knows that in order to completely start over, he would have to start from scratch. So he burned his Social Security card, and then he burned the rest of the cash he had. It was during this period that Chris began introducing himself to others as Alex Supertramp. He hitchhiked across Arizona, Nevada, and California, surviving on the generosity of strangers and his own abilities. He scavenged for food, he camped in the open, and carried only a small pack with essentials. His independence and his charm often drew people in, and even though he avoided long-term attachments, he left impressions on those he met. One of the best connections Chris made was with Wayne Westerberg, a grain elevator operator in Carthage, South Dakota. Wayne first met Chris when he offered him a ride, and the two quickly developed a friendship. Chris worked for Wayne off and on, doing physical labor on the farm and at the grain elevators. Unlike most people Chris encountered, Wayne managed to earn his trust, and the two stayed in contact for a while. Chris also crossed paths with Jan Burris and her partner Bob. These two are drifters who sold used books and trinkets at flea markets. They treated Chris almost like a son, giving him supplies, meals, and friendship during his travels. Chris confided in them about a few things, and though he never revealed everything in his past, they sensed something happened to him in life which caused him to pursue independence. In 1991, Chris sought out greater adventure. He purchased a secondhand canoe in Arizona and set out to paddle down the Colorado River. The journey tested both his endurance and his navigational skills to an extreme level. At times, he drifted through calm and serene canyons, while at others, he battled against rough waters and strong winds. He eventually paddled across the border into Mexico, navigating irrigation canals and winding waterways. He was stopped and briefly detained for not having papers, but he was released once he gave them some excuse. The truth was he didn't have any papers. He didn't have an ID. He burned all his stuff. The trip nearly ended in disaster when he lost his way and almost capsized, but he managed to push through. Chris would write in his journal that this episode reinforced his belief that true freedom required embracing risk and comfort. When he reached the Gulf of California, he was disappointed that there was so much pollution, and he felt this wasn't true wilderness with all this haze. So after several weeks, he returned to the U.S., exhausted, but he's exhilarated. Some duck hunters had dropped him off. Chris wrote in his journal that he hadn't seen another human being in a month. Writer John Krakauer said that during the 36 days Chris was in Mexico, he survived on 5 pounds of rice and whatever he could catch from the water. Some people resent Chris for the way he chose to live because, unlike him, others don't have the luxury of choosing to be poor, while Chris purposely abandons the comfort of society in order to feel free and cut ties. Many people are forced into homelessness. For them, being homeless and scrounging around for food is not an act of rebellion or philosophy, but a daily struggle for survival. This makes Chris's journey appear to some as privileged or even dismissive of the reality faced by those who truly have no other option. Chris could pack up at any time and head to his parents' house in Virginia. He could leave and attend Harvard Law School, but he prefers being homeless. After all this drifting around, Chris briefly settled in Bullhead City, Arizona in 1991. There he got a job at McDonald's. He could have gotten a job anywhere with his 2 degrees, but Chris didn't want to make a lot of money. He wanted to be poor. This settlement into Arizona is going to be the most stability he's had since he graduated college. He rented a small trailer, so he had a bed every night. His coworkers at McDonald's described him as polite and hardworking, but they noted he was strange at times, like his refusal to wear socks with his uniform. He was also confronted multiple times by the manager for not bathing. He's getting a paycheck from McDonald's every week, and he feels like this is too much money and too close to being a regular member of society. He wrote in his journal, "Tramping is too easy with all this money. My days were more exciting when I was penniless and I had to forage around for my next meal." For a time, it seems as though Chris might be content with a simpler but rooted existence, like having a small home and a job, but as usual, he grew restless. The dreams of the open road, the need for solitude, and his vision of Alaska as the ultimate destination drew him away once more. He wanted to go back to camping on mountains and in deserts. By early 1992, Chris had been wandering for nearly 2 years. He had lived off the land, survived hunger, and became friends with people who cared deeply for him. But despite these connections, he never stayed in one place for long. Alaska had always been his ultimate destination, the place where he would finally strip down life to its barest essentials and live entirely off the land. Every experience in the lower states had been, in his mind, just training sessions for this final challenge. From abandoning his car in the Arizona desert, to hopping trains, to paddling a canoe in Mexico, to working alongside farmers and fast food employees. He embraced risk, rejected materialism, and pursued freedom. He decides the time has finally come, so he goes back and retrieves his .22 rifle he buried in the desert. While many questioned his choices, those who met him rarely forgot him. By the time he was ready to head towards Alaska, he had shed nearly every tie to his former life and fully embodied the persona of Alex Supertramp. For him, the wilderness of Alaska was not just a destination, but the final piece of his journey and the ultimate test of this 100% independence that he had spent years preparing for. Chris is going to drift and hitchhike until he reaches Alaska. I mentioned earlier that some people didn't like Chris's choices. Chris wants to be in Alaska, living by himself and foraging his own food and supplies. Some didn't like this either. They thought, how could you just abandon your privileged life? They say things like, yeah, your parents weren't the best, but look at all they did for you. And you can't just abandon society and rules and the government. Many told him, sorry, Chris, we all have to put up with this shit, so do you. But Chris doesn't care what anyone has to say. He's on his own now. Chris's own words in his journal are, "Nothing is more damaging to the spirit within a man than a secure future." Look, I'm a big fan of do whatever you want, anything at all. Just don't hurt people. I don't think Chris was hurting anyone except his parents, but if his parents were abusive, as his sister Corrine alleges, then it's hard to feel sorry for them. I did read that many years later they changed their lives and found God, but back in 1992, that wasn't the case, allegedly. Something I keep coming back to is that something drove Chris away. Something made him want to abandon all the comforts of his life and forage through the woods for food. Chris is going to get exactly what he's looking for, but it will unfortunately end badly for him. This isn't going to end how he envisioned. I think it's important for all of us to pause and remember that Chris is only 24 years old. He's been surviving mostly independently for the last 2 years, but this is not a 50-year-old man who has decades of wisdom and life experience. Chris, although incredibly smart, is still very young. In April 1992, Chris hitchhiked from South Dakota to Fairbanks, Alaska. His friend Wayne, that he had worked for back in South Dakota, asked Chris why he didn't just fly to Alaska. Chris said he'd prefer to hitchhike instead. He thought flying would be cheating. Wayne received a postcard in the mail. It read, "Greetings from Fairbanks. This is the last you shall hear from me, Wayne. Arrived here 2 days ago. It was very difficult to catch rides in the Yukon Territory, but I finally got here. Please return all mail I received to the sender. It might be a very long time before I return south. If this adventure proves fatal and you don't ever hear from me again, I want you to know that you're a great man. I now walk into the wild." On April 28, 1992, an electrician named Jim Gallion is driving along in Fairbanks, Alaska, and he spots a hitchhiker standing in the snow. He's a young, skinny guy. He's wearing a backpack that looks pretty heavy, and he's got a long rifle. Jim pulls over and offers the kid a ride. Chris tells Jim that he'd like a ride to the Denali National Park, telling him he intended to walk deep into the brush and live off the land for a few months. Jim and Chris rode for 3 hours. Jim says Chris came off as extremely intelligent and didn't seem cocky or arrogant in any way like a lot of other hikers he picked up were. According to writer John Krakauer, Jim was concerned about this new friend he had just made, saying Chris's gear seemed underweight for the rugged conditions of where he's heading. Chris told Jim that the only food in his pack was a 10-pound bag of rice. He had no compass. The only navigation item he had was a road map that he picked up at a gas station. And when they arrived where Chris asked to be dropped off, he left the map in Jim's truck, along with his comb and his money, which was 85 cents. He also hands Jim his watch, telling him, "I don't want to know what time it is. I don't want to know what day it is or where I am. None of that matters." Jim tried to talk Chris out of going. He tells him he's heading into dangerous territory. There's nothing for at least 20 miles or so. It's very cold. You have no supplies. Just come with me instead. But Chris is determined to do this. Jim asks him if his family will know he's out here in case they don't hear from him. They could sound the alarm. He says he hasn't spoken to his family in a couple years, and there's nothing he wouldn't be able to handle on his own. Jim says, "Well, I can't talk you out of going, but how about I buy you some nice gear?" But Chris politely declines. Jim is thinking to himself, I give this kid 1 week. He'll be out of this place. Without food, he's going to turn around and come right back. Jim drops Chris off at the head of the Stampede Trail and waves goodbye. That was the very last sighting of Chris alive. Chris begins walking west, deep into the Alaskan wilderness. After a few days of walking, he comes across something huge. He sees this old rusted bus just sitting there. It was an old Fairbanks, Alaska public transit bus, and it's been sitting there for decades. It's got a big number 142 on it. This is like heaven for Chris. It even had a metal cot inside where he could sleep. This is where Chris decides he will stay. Plus, it was right next to a river, so Chris would have close access to water. This area is 20 miles from the closest highway. To you and I, we see a decaying old bus with broken windows and overgrown weeds, but to Chris, this is his sanctuary and his home base. He called it the magic bus in his journal. To me, it's kind of ironic because he's so far against society, but he's using society's remnants, in this case, a rusty public bus, in order to survive. Everything we learn about Chris for the next 4 months is from his journals he wrote in. He also had a camera with him that had a self-timer on it. He would take an occasional photo of himself. Author John Krakauer, who I've mentioned a million times in this episode, he was able to compile and summarize a lot of Chris's writings. The first few days were a struggle. Chris wrote words like weakness, snowed in, and disaster. He saw a grizzly bear on day 4, but he didn't shoot it. He shot at some ducks, but he missed. He wrote 4th day famine. On May 9th, which was about 10 days after he arrived, he finally killed something he could eat, a single small squirrel. He also ate edible plants. Chris had this book that showed him what plants and flowers were edible and which ones were poisonous. This came in handy almost every day. Chris was eating anything he could get his hands on: mushrooms, berries, porcupines, squirrels, birds, anything. Chris had a lot of knowledge, but he found that hunting for food was much harder than he'd anticipated. One of the biggest examples of this was the moose incident. Chris spotted a moose off in the distance. He takes out his rifle and stalks it for a bit and eventually shoots at it, and the moose collapses. So this moose is about 600 pounds and would keep Chris fed for months. He was so happy and was jumping up and down. He brings the moose back to the bus area and he does what hunters do when they've killed the animal. Chris ate really good that night. But a few days later, he checks in on his meat and sees it's covered in maggots. Chris didn't properly preserve the meat. He thought smoking the meat would keep it fresh, but it didn't. He didn't have the resources to properly preserve the meat, so this entire moose is now wasted. Chris wrote in his journal that this was the biggest tragedy of his life. It's not that he lost the meat. I mean, yeah, it sucks, but what bothered him the most was that he wasted a life for nothing. He shot and killed a living, breathing animal that didn't have to die. He was really shook up about this and wrote that it was his inadequacy that caused this, and he wished he never shot the moose. But a few days later, he seemed to be back in better spirits. Chris is pretty much hungry all the time. He's very skinny. He needs his strength to be able to hunt. The only thing he had plenty of was water, since the magic bus was right next to a small river. In July 1992, Chris has been at his spot for about 3 months. Chris wrote in his journal that he felt satisfied. He's ready to go. He's not ready to rejoin society or anything like that, but he's ready to continue wandering to the next spot, maybe a little closer to town. He says goodbye to the magic bus and loads his backpack and rifle and sets out. He retraces his steps that he took to get here and comes across a big problem. And that's the Teklanika River. When he crossed it back in April, it was frozen. You could easily walk across it. Now it's July, and all the snow has melted from the glaciers. This serene river was now really deep and rushing really fast. It would be impossible to get across without a bridge or a boat of some kind. Chris is now trapped. This is the only way to get out of here, and it's impossible. This river doesn't care that he was done here and ready to leave. Feeling defeated, Chris makes his way back to the bus. He wrote that he was discouraged but would just wait around for the water to recede. According to an article on Gray Line, Alaska, what Chris didn't know, and is so heartbreaking, is that if he would have just walked a little further, maybe half a mile up the river, he would have come across a hand-operated tram that would have gotten him across the river. I had to look this up because I was confused about what it is. It's basically a little cart you can get in with cables and pulleys, and it will take you across the river. As the weeks dragged on, Chris's writings were different. In one of his books, he wrote, "Happiness is only real when shared." This line is super important to people who have interest in Chris's story because it seems like he had a shift in his philosophy, almost like he was renouncing his solitary state. Maybe he really was ready to be with people again, or maybe he was recognizing that joy, while possible in isolation, is better having people around you. It seems like at this point Chris still needed his freedom, but he also needed companionship. His journal entries became shorter and more urgent. He wrote that he was very weak and no longer able to hunt. Then he wrote that he was too weak to leave the bus. The last few days he documented were just slash marks. In August 1992, this is his fourth month in the Alaskan wilderness at the bus. He left a note on the bus door. Attention possible visitors. SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries and will return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless. He was no longer outside collecting berries, though. He was inside the bus and paralyzed. Chris's physical condition had deteriorated tremendously. He was down to just 70 pounds or so. Chris became very sick, and I'll get into what he was sick from in a moment. But it's so sad to see this man who only wanted solitude was now begging for someone to rescue him. He wanted and needed people again, and it was too late. On September 6, 1992, some hunters in the area came across an abandoned public transit bus sitting in the wilderness. It was really out of place. It's complete wilderness and then this bus. So they walk up to it. Pinned on the door of the bus was a note written in shaky letters. It says, I need your help. I am injured. I'm near death, and I'm too weak to hike out of here. Please remain to save me. They walk inside the bus and see a lot of books and papers and makeshift tools. They see a sleeping bag and knew right away what they were going to find. Whoever is in this sleeping bag is very small. It was the body of Christopher McCandless. He was 24 years old. Chris had been dead for approximately 2.5 weeks. One of the biggest mysteries about his death was that he didn't directly starve to death. He was doing okay. He was eating enough to barely survive, but he was making it. But he noted that he had eaten some wild potato seeds, and these are generally considered safe. But researchers into Chris's death believe that they were possibly contaminated with a toxic alkaloid or mold-produced toxin that could interfere with the body's ability to metabolize food. So if Chris was eating handfuls of these wild potato seeds, and we know he was basically accelerating his starvation. It also would have caused paralysis. He wrote in his journal, extremely weak, fault of potato seed, much trouble just to stand up, starving, great jeopardy. So Chris became weak and paralyzed, which caused him not to be able to get out and forage food. This is what many believe caused him to starve to death. It wasn't because he wasn't doing enough. He was unable to. He was trapped in the bus. Another theory is that he confused the wild potato seeds with sweet pea. They look really similar, and the wild potato is safe, but sweet pea is poisonous. For Chris, the small difference between the wild potato and the sweet pea may have been the difference between life and death. It's totally possible that he ate the wrong plant. Chris wasn't being reckless. He had field guides, he had plant books, he knew there were dangers and carefully tried to make sure he avoided these things. Something that we wish Chris would have known is that, remember that map he bought? Well, he left it in Jim's truck when he was dropped off at the head of the Stampede Trail. If he would have just kept that map with him, he would have known that there was a supply cabin for the forest rangers just 6 miles away from the bus. It was fully stocked with blankets, food, and first aid supplies. Some ask why Chris didn't start a large fire so he could be found. Those who know Chris say he would never take a chance at burning down a forest. That would be against his beliefs and what he stood for. Investigators arrived at the bus and went through the process of trying to identify him. They found his name was Chris McCandless. They found his final note, which read, I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye and may God bless all. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you will see the note on your screen. So remember Chris's friend Wayne back in South Dakota? Well, he gets a call on September 13th, 1992. His buddy tells him, "Quick, turn on the radio. They're talking about some kid who starved to death in the wilderness in Alaska. It sounds like your buddy Chris." Wayne calls the Alaska State Troopers and says, "I know who this is." So Wayne didn't know anything about Chris's family. Chris wouldn't talk about them. But he remembered that when Chris started working for him, he had to fill out a W-4 tax form. He was able to get Chris's social security number, which police were able to trace him back to Virginia. Chris's parents were notified that their son had been found. The abandoned bus became a shrine for people who wanted to see Chris's home. It became a place where visitors left notes, flowers, and gifts for Chris. That was until 2020, when the Alaskan government felt it was too unsafe, so they had the bus moved to a museum. They actually had to have it airlifted out of there. They also felt too many people were idolizing Chris and may try to imitate what he did. Alaska has lots of stories of people who underestimate its wilderness. The story of Chris McCandless has people divided. Was he this reckless fool who was arrogant and unprepared, or was he courageous and a hero who refused to settle for what society expected of him? Society expected him to graduate college and then get a good job, find a woman and marry her and settle down and have children. Chris didn't want any of that, and that's okay. I've told my son and daughter many times, there's no book that says you have to do all of those things. I think Chris was naive and his gear was insufficient, but I believe he was sincere and he knew this life of extreme independence that he wanted, it would involve risk. Chris McCandless walked into the wild searching for freedom. He found it, but he suffered significantly. And at the end, he wanted human connection again, but it was too late. He wrote it down. Happiness is only real when shared. There was a book written about Chris called Into the Wild. I've referenced its author several times in this story. It was later developed into a movie in 2007, directed by Sean Penn. I watched it and I really loved that Pearl Jam did the whole soundtrack. If alive today, Chris would be 57 years old. Chris, I imagine you're in heaven still at 24 years old, hopping trains and canoeing and doing all those things you loved. Rest in peace to Chris McCandless. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all.